Hello, I'm Gordon Haff, author of Computing Next, How the Cloud Opens the Future. By day, I'm cloud evangelist at Red Hat, leading supplier of commercial open source software. And before joining Red Hat a few years ago, I was an IT industry analyst for about a decade. The way the book's put together allows for readers of considerably different background to still get a lot out of it. It's written in essentially an episodic kind of way, so you can kind of pick it up and read one chapter and skip ahead to another chapter, skip a chapter that's too introductory, or skip a chapter that maybe dives into more detail than you want, and you really won't lose the flow of the book. Quite a few industry experts that I know have also been kind enough to let me reprint with very light editing some of their better blog posts or other written pieces. So the book really brings together not just my thinking around cloud computing, but the thinking of a number of significant industry experts. I view the book as a tour through cloud computing's past, present, and future. When I was an IT industry analyst, I often found it useful to think about where things came from, and to a degree that they were reimaginings or recreations of technologies or trends of the past, thinking about how things were different or how things were similar and how conditions today might be different. And cloud computing has a lot of interesting predecessors and antecedents. I also look at cloud computing in the here and now. What are its benefits, and how should you go about adopting it? So, for example, openness in many aspects is an important part of the cloud computing discussion. Whether we're talking open source, open standards, open APIs, communities associated with open source development, these are all very much part of the cloud computing story. In fact, I think there's a good argument to be made that without open source and open standards and open APIs, we really wouldn't have cloud computing as we know it today. And part of that is being able to span hybrid infrastructures, hybrid IT, which is also an increasingly important part of the conversation in cloud computing. I also look at things like security, which is really too narrow a term. We're really talking more about a broader set of IT governance and compliance issues. And those are very much of the cloud computing discussion. And in fact, they tend to be at the top of surveys when people talk about what concerns them in some respects about adopting clouds. So I give some advice there. And then I look to the future, because one of the reasons cloud computing is exciting so many people is that it's really at the intersection of many of the key trends happening around computing more broadly today. So big data, mobility, bring your own device. A variety of trends are really coming together in really a transformational kind of a way. I've been involved in the topics associated with this book for maybe 6 or 7 years now when they first came onto the scene. I started out as an IT industry analyst focusing on processors and servers predominantly, along with some of the associated networking. But really what's happened over the last decade or so is a lot of the really interesting advances have moved up the level, up the stack, as we tend to say in the industry, to things like, first of all, virtualization, and now to cloud computing, which really can be thought of as the next evolution of virtualization. Virtualization, server virtualization, has been a big topic, but is really still focused on the server, albeit a virtual version of a server. With cloud computing, we really move beyond that to a much more fundamentally services-oriented view of IT. Probably Probably the hardest thing about writing this book was how much change is happening in this space. I started in earnest probably about 18 months or so ago, and I've kind of worked on it in sections, and what would happen is sort of finish a section, move on to the next section, and then change would happen, and I'd really start to rethink some of the ways I was describing certain trends, and I'd really end up going back and doing a lot of rewriting. So it's been a very iterative type of process. I have no illusions that what's there is in any way etched in stone, but I think it gives a pretty good overview of where cloud computing is today. Action's happening in a lot of areas right now. One important area of action is a lot of this stuff is getting very real. This isn't just talking about trends any longer. It's about actually implementing new IT infrastructures, which is pretty exciting, even if it maybe doesn't get as many headlines as the higher level, more theoretical discussions do. But there's a lot of real activity going on in organizations who are building clouds. Another interesting area is platform as a service, which was really pretty new when I started my book. We tended to have these offerings from single service providers, single language, and it was something really for developers to do some tire kicking. But they've evolved into much more mature offerings, and now with, for example, Red Hat's OpenShift offering, there's an enterprise version as well, so something that a company can run on their own site. And this has gotten a lot of people really excited who weren't that excited about the hosted offerings. And in fact, you have fairly conservative analyst firms like Gartner talking about platform as a service now as maybe the next generation of enterprise application development. So I think that's pretty big news. As we look to the future, one of the reasons I think that cloud computing has generated so much excitement is it's not something that's standalone. It really intersects with some of the most important trends happening in IT. So the whole big data analysis trend, the whole mobility, bring your own device trend, one could argue the social trend. And it really comes together with these things into something where the sum is greater than the parts. And it's really changing how we're thinking about doing computing. And from a business standpoint, it's changing how a lot of companies think about IT. So you have these businesses that traditionally really were not IT computer-centric businesses, and increasingly they are, even in the most unlikely industries like farming.